Good evening. My name is Chris Bedford. I'm the Helen and Charles Schwab Director of SFMOMA. First of all, I want to apologize to those of you who have been waiting around online for a little bit. We were supposed to have started 20 minutes ago. We had a few technical issues, including the lights going off. Fortunately, the lights are back on, and I'm here with you, and I'm grateful to whoever has stuck with us and is joining us at SFMOMA this evening. So I'm on the second floor of the museum at the moment. I'm very proud to say that come the opening of our forthcoming Seeker exhibition at SFMOMA, we will commit the entirety of the second floor of this institution as a free public space. That means that in total at this museum we'll have over 66,000 square feet of space that's open to the public free of charge at any time, which is a pretty extraordinary offering. That expanse of space is bigger than the vast majority of institutions in and of itself. So we're very proud to have taken that step. We're very proud to have taken it in the context of the forthcoming Seeker exhibition and our effort to foreground the work of Bay Area-based artists. I think it's my deep conviction and the conviction of many of our curators that some of the greatest and most relevant work in the world is being made right here on our doorstep. And those artists belong in these galleries along with the great masters of the 20th into the 21st century that we've foregrounded as an institution throughout the course of our history. So it's a very proud moment to open our doors as wide as possible to our public. In speaking of opening doors, that is the great vision and conviction of this institution going forward. Our desire is to open as many doors as possible to the maximum number of people. And our big driver for doing that is developing a research-driven, equity-centered art history that extends to all of our viewers, whether it's a visitor from Japan, whether it's a visitor from Korea, whether it's somebody who lives in Berkeley or Oakland, an experience of elite culture that is enormously accessible. So our spirit is one of radical hospitality, and we aim to be as diverse as possible in our address at this institution. So in service of that, we recognize that removing all barriers to access is incredibly important, thus making the second floor of this museum free. We also recognize that it's important to speak in a language that a broad number of people can really understand. And the exhibition I'm going to talk about this evening is a really fabulous example of being generous in our address and opening up some really complex social questions through a series of objects arrayed around me here that speak in a language that I think is differently and commonly accessible. In order to do a lot of that work of growing and diversifying our audience, we're developing as an institution certain key areas of focus. One of them is a focus on artists with disabilities. The Bay Area is renowned for its sponsorship of artists working with disability and producing extraordinary work, and this has been the case over many decades, maybe a half century in the Bay Area is a great point of distinction for us. Another point of emphasis will be championing the work of LGBTQ+ artists. Obviously, we live in a city that has championed the cause of the queer community, the trans community, other communities for many, many, many years, and we want to acknowledge that and become an epicenter of creative production, and to make sure that that creative production exists at the very core of the art history that we present to our publics. We're also very interested in foregrounding ecological consciousness as a part of our program. And again, it's something that's deeply rooted in the Bay Area. I want to emphasize in saying all of those things and marrying it to the fact that artists of color are going to be an enormous focus for this institution going forward, that our concepts of diversity are endlessly elastic. So it doesn't stop with those 4 points of emphasis. What our effort is to continually complicate ourselves and our own stories in order to create the most diverse, equitable, and representative art history that we can at SFMOMA, one that's befitting the extraordinary diversity of the 21st century. So that's our big and grand mission. A lot of that work is done on a smaller scale, acquisition by acquisition, public program by public program, exhibition by exhibition. And standing in the midst of this one in particular, I sort of feel the force of that commitment. So I thought I would begin, before digging into the show itself, by saying a little bit about my own investment in sport as a subject and as sport as a subject within art history, which I think has a sort of unique purchase on the consciousness of the public. So at the risk of speaking too personally, I'll share that I went to Oberlin College and graduated from there in 2000. And I went there with the intent of being a swimmer on one hand and majoring in English literature on the other. I was instead totally seduced by American football, ended up playing American football there and majoring in art history. And the reason I majored in art history was the amazing university art museum that many of the professors used there to teach the history of art. So it was a great privilege to learn not from textbooks, but from objects. And I think it was from that experience that I feel institutions like this one, on such a vast scale, can be the biggest classrooms for learning art history in the world and should be considered that way. This is one massive classroom, I think, to expand your mind and think about difficult, complex topics in ways that are really accessible. So when I was at Oberlin, and playing football on one hand and learning art history on the other, I had the great privilege of working alongside a woman named Patricia Matthews, who's one of the founding voices in the feminist tradition within art history in the United States. And within all of those classes, I was taught that gender wasn't something, or sexuality wasn't something that was just given, it was something that was societally forged. Then on the other hand, in the locker room, playing football, what I was taught, and I think most men who play that kind of sport are naturalized to think we're all just expressing our natural selves. We're born this way, you know, this is a physical sport, we're aggressive, we're all basically the same in that. And I think what I began to see was that there was a fundamental contradiction between those two positions. So if I was being taught in a class on feminist art history that gender and sexuality are a construct, why couldn't the same thing be applied to the idea of masculinity? So that gave rise to an interest that spanned decades now, beginning with people like Matthew Barney. In fact, this is the home to one of the great collections of Matthew Barney's work in the world. And I remember sitting in the library at Oberlin College, paging through some of Matthew's early catalogs and thinking, this is exactly my consciousness, and it was completely revelatory to me. And it resulted in a career-long investment in art and its relationship to sport, which I've explored throughout various exhibitions throughout the course of my life. The first of them happened at the Los Angeles County Museum, just slightly south of here. Took on really massive form at the Wexner Center for the Arts in years following. And many of the works that I actually included in that exhibition, which looked at gender, sexuality, masculinity, all through the lens of sport, are included here in this show. So in lots of ways, it feels like a homecoming to me to be in this space and chatting with you about some of these artists. So with that said, I think we'll begin the tour just by first acknowledging the title of the exhibition, which I think is wonderful. It's called Both Teams Played Hard, and it's actually taken from a quote by the great NBA star Rasheed Wallace. And I think it was in 2003, after a game, he was being interviewed. And the interviewer, I think he was irritated by the questions. And so rather than answer the questions that he took to be inane, he simply repeated the same phrase in response to every prompt. He said, both teams played hard, both teams played hard, both teams played hard, over and over again, hence the title of this show. I think the interest there is that there are moments when the sporting spectacle can be highly artistic, and we'll see that throughout the course of the exhibition, and vice versa. So Rasheed Wallace, Rasheed Johnson's an artist, Rasheed Wallace, assuming the guise of performance artist in the aftermath of a basketball game, I think has great purchase on the way that this show is organized. So with that said, I think we'll begin by looking at a work by the artist probably that I'm closest to in the world, and that is Mark Bradford, born in 1961 in Los Angeles and still based there. Mark is absolutely, there's some great sound in this video. Mark is renowned for his work as a painter, and he's very famous for using the phrase, if Home Depot doesn't carry it, Mark Bradford doesn't need it. And I think that's a way of saying he rejects the ways and the mores and the disciplines of the art world and wants to make art his own way. So he basically reinvented painting using paper and has invented a language of abstraction that lets the world all the way in. You can't look at Mark's painting without thinking about the social constructs from which it emerges. And I think that tendency to, through seduction and through artistic invention, force a conversation with society and difficult subjects has structured the entirety of Mark's career, and I think it's at the very core of this work practice too. So this was made in 2003. I included this in an exhibition called Hard Targets at the Wexner Center. It's one of only a very few works of video that Mark's made throughout the course of his career. I spent so much time talking to him, it's hard to know when I heard quotes and what those quotes interpreted. But he always said to me, I imagine a world in which we experience 12 channels of blackness. I think what he means by that, what I know he means by that is that black identity is endlessly heterogeneous. There are many, many, many different expressions and nobody owns any of them. And I, Mark, demand the right to exist as many subjectivities concurrently. So I think you see that very, very vividly in this pretty extraordinary video. So he's growling into the camera in a way that sort of mimics, maybe even mocks the aggression that is not even the subtext, but the text of highly aggressive male sports. He's wearing the colors of the Los Angeles Lakers, but is also wearing them in the form of an incredibly cumbersome dress that causes him here to fall over and expose what he's wearing underneath, which is just a pair of cargo shorts. He's also playing with the idea, and I've witnessed this myself, that people will commonly mistake him for a basketball player simply because he's 6'8" tall. But then, of course, at the end of the video, he shoots a perfect basket. So the layers of complexity involved in this, I think, are highly characteristic of Mark and cause us to think about race, about power, about sexuality, about gender, about spectacle, and about the role of the artist interpreting all of those things in concert. So an extraordinary work in SFMOMA's collection, as are many in this room, and one that I never tire of watching. Also remarkably, it was made 20 years ago, and somehow Mark looks actually younger than he did 2 decades in the past, which I find amazing and bemusing. So moving from Mark to another icon of the 20th into 21st century, this is Jeff Koons. So born in 1955, a little bit older than Mark, and this is called Dr. Duncanstein, and it's from 1985. And this plays, again, a little bit like Mark, with a variety of ideas that interrelate commercial culture and the art world in a really fascinating way. And this is actually a very straightforward work of art in that sense. It has an artist frame, so he's claiming the frame as his artistic intervention here. And also, although he doesn't call it out in the object label, the matting too, the means of presentation. But what's being presented here is simply an NBA poster. This is an advertisement for the NBA, where the character of the player, Dr. Duncanstein in this case, is being dramatized through advertising form. So he's a magician or he's a wizard, he's conjuring magic, and he's holding 2 basketballs that suggest that capacity to be sort of a magical human. But Jeff Koons, I think, aware of the fact that there are various artistic tropes at play here, particularly the use of attributes. So attributes meaning objects through which you can identify the character of the person. That goes all the way back to the Renaissance, St. Peter, St. Paul, St. Andrew. So he's playing with attributes and the artists that generated this and intermingling them. So socks and basketball shoes, but then also the garb of a doctor and the implication of magic. But nothing about this is artistic creation other than the identification of it as art and the installment of it within a frame to suggest a different status, which causes us, I think, to think very differently about what's being presented, who's being commodified, and who has the power in this transaction. So very, very different in appearance to Mark Bradford's video, but I think speaking some of the same languages and asking some of the same difficult and dicey questions about race and power and economics in a way that I find endlessly fascinating. Another really familiar artist to me, and again of a somewhat similar vintage to Mark and to Jeff, this is Paul Pfeiffer, an artist born in 1966 in Honolulu, who is now based in New York City. And this work is called The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, number 6. So that invokes the myth of the end of the world as described in the Bible. And I think the biblical reference in the title here has a relationship to the iconicity of this body and the way it appears to be suspended in space. So Paul makes these works by scouring the NBA archive online, finding images from that archive that he finds compelling, and then very deliberately erasing certain aspects of that found image to produce something other entirely. So in this case, the blurring is part of the original photograph, but the absence of markings on the floor, the absence of any insignia on the surface of the uniform, the absence of the basket itself, the absence of other figures, appears to suspend the figure in isolation. And for me, that talks about the near religious obsession that fans can develop with sport. And maybe, you know, absent the lived experience of a deity in somebody's life, a fan might actually see an athlete this way. So this is one of many, many works that Paul has made entitled Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse that use this same trope to isolate the heroic figure and ask us to interrogate our own investment in these athletes as maybe contemporary deities. So maybe more than Mark and more than Jeff Koons, Paul has committed almost the entirety of his career to the sporting arena, and his interrogation of it as a way to bring us closer to the way that we culturally organize. So an unbelievably important work, and again, in SFMOMA's collection. This great work by David Hammons, I think I could talk about forever. The curator of this exhibition, Erin O'Toole, who leads our photography department, migrated away from her expertise, which lives most comfortably with Jeff Koons and with Paul Pfeiffer, to embrace this work as really the centerpiece of the exhibition in its myriad complexity. So David Hammons, this is an artist born in 1943, so older than the others we've discussed to this point. Still based in Los Angeles. I personally hold David Hammons in the highest conceivable esteem. If let's say, Marcel Duchamp changed the course of art history by claiming objects as ready-mades and asking us to consider everything and anything art, the only person I think is really the true inheritor or the standard bearer of that tradition that's living and working today is David Hammons. He doesn't have a style. He works in a vast variety of media. He's a painter, he's a sculptor, he's an installation artist, he's a video artist, he's an intellectual, he's a conceptual artist. He uses any means at his disposal to interrogate the cultural phenomenon that's of great interest to him. He has, throughout the course of his life, used basketball as one lens to talk about particularly race, economics, and power. And these basketball drawings are a really good example. I want to emphasize that in the hands of somebody as masterful as Hammons, these works always have a character of beauty about them, even if there's a kind of conceptual incision. So these are made by dipping a basketball in graphite and then bouncing the ball on the surface of paper to produce something like an overall effect. And I find it interesting on the formal level because it calls into question in a really literal way, or reveals in a really literal way, the extent to which painting itself is a physical or even potentially athletic event. I think Mark is very interested in that. He works on a really, really large scale. He has a vast wingspan, and he makes paintings that attest to that, and they feel really, really physical. Jackson Pollock, another artist who worked very athletically, always said that he was nature, and there was a relationship between his body as a natural thing and athletic movement in the production of his paintings, which were referred to during the period as all-overs or overalls. And I think that there's a very similar tendency going on here in David Hammons' work, produced through an entirely different method, but there's a level of beauty and physicality in the surface that I find completely beguiling. But also, like Mark and like Jeff Koons and like Paul Pfeiffer, it's not a purely aesthetic experience. It's something that forces you through the details of production to contend with the world of which it's a part and from which it comes. So small details here, like the letters NBA, you can see inscribed on the surface, given how hard he bounced the ball on the surface, having dipped it in graphite. And then, of course, there's the relationship to the bricks that are the basis of this drawing, painting, sculpture, installation. And that speaks very directly to David Hammons' critique of American culture and the commodification and exploitation of black athletes. And he says very eloquently here, and I wanted to read, "Basketball was viewed as a means of escape from life in the ghetto. but this dream was beyond the reach for many. Basketball has become a problem for the Black community because the kids aren't getting an education. They're pawns in someone else's game. So I think you can unpack that interrogation of basketball as a cultural phenomenon in tandem with looking at the sheer complexity of this work to begin to understand David Hammond's both, I'm sure, I feel fandom on one hand, and then discomfort with the mechanisms of sports culture, particularly the NBA, as it's become manifest in the 20th into 21st century. So again, an object that one could talk about quite literally forever. Similarly, and this is, I feel like I'm in my native habitat talking about art and sport back and forth, particularly in the context of the World Cup, where I feel like the eyes of the world are trained on sport in a different way, and we're seeing that slippage between spectacle on one hand and pure sporting enjoyment on the other. Sometimes I think athletes and sporting events do aesthetics better than museums do, and I think there's a lot that we have to learn in the way that they dramatize the experience of sport. And I think a lot of that is registered in the work of David Huffman, who is a peer of Mark Bradford's. In fact, he emerged into the consciousness of the art world with a momentous, historically important exhibition done at the Studio Museum by the great director-curator Thelma Golden in 2000 called Freestyle, which introduced a whole generation of Black American artists to the United States and to the world that have gone on to become the defining figures of their generation. Among them David Huffman, among them Mark Bradford, Glenn Ligon, and many others. So David emerged around that same time, and I think you see here an interest in the aesthetics of spectacle. I think you see here an interest in the aesthetics of basketball and a deep commitment to the sport and passion for it. David is a lifelong fan of the Warriors and is an Oakland-based artist, and in fact an artist trustee at SFMOMA. So I've had the privilege of visiting him in his studio and sort of burrowing into his mind a little bit. And I think what you see on the surface here are a variety of mark-making mechanisms that are intended as sort of sugar cubes for you to think about different ways of societal organization. So there's glitter in this surface, which might not be apparent through the video that you're watching, but it gives sort of a glamour to the surface. There are painterly gestures like this one that remind me of artists like David Reed. There's the very literal inscription of the image of a basketball on the surface. There are painterly moments that are very much all his own. He's using, in addition to acrylic, spray paint, which is something, to harken back to Mark Bradford's comment, if Home Depot doesn't carry it, Mark Bradford doesn't need it. So there is a lack of preciousness in this surface that's very, very characteristic of David's work, and something that I think binds a lot of the artists in this room, like a refusal to leave the world behind in order to make a purely aesthetic point. This is both aesthetic and it's social, and the artists are holding those two things in equal measure to produce a really accessible experience of art and culture through an image that interrogates basketball. And I think that's one of the things that makes this show so important. It hews to that concept of making the sophisticated accessible by approaching very difficult ideas through a lens that's actually quite approachable. I don't think that there's anything more approachable or more sort of common or native in our collective experience than that of sport. And this exhibition existing on the second floor of SFMOMA during a period of time when we're making this second floor completely free makes abundant sense to me as we try to fling our doors wide open to everyone and make the point that this is a museum for a general population, whether you have a PhD in art history or whether you're a basketball player. It's sort of for everyone. Briefly, I just wanted to talk about this painting too, also by David Huffman. And this one is from 2011, acrylic paint on the mixed ground. And this is a little more simple and refined in its composition and hangs next to a photograph by Chanel Stone that I'll talk about in just a second. But here you see an absence of the more sort of aggressive, obviously painterly gestures, and instead a more muted investment in creating a beautiful surface. This reminds me very much of Seurat on one hand. It reminds me of great living artists like Howardina Pindell, who use repeated patterns to produce an overall effect. In this case, the title Seeding, I think, plays with the idea of growth, of fertility, and then brings that into collision with basketball as an organizing concept for a formal composition. And I think it's one of those objects in this gallery that is differently and easily beautiful. It's beautiful in a way that feels more seamless with a traditional history of abstract painting. But still, you can't get away from the social content, which I find to be one of the defining characteristics of the arc of David's entire career. And then moving on to maybe back to Erin O'Toole's more native terrain of a focus on photography, I think this is distinguished by being one of the quietest and most beautiful, restrained, and meditative works in the exhibition. It's by Chanel Stone, an artist born in 1992, so significantly younger than everybody else in the exhibition. And this work was made in 2019. It's an inkjet print. And you can see it has a dark grisaille palette. And I think the intent there is to point to the sort of modernism of the markings that define a basketball court. So there are aesthetic ideas that structure, in particular, the way sports fields are presented. So whether it's a hockey rink, whether it's a football field, whether it's a soccer field, or whether it's a basketball court, there is something in common with the way that the modernist grid has been used to organize compositions historically. And I find that to be fascinating. The show, I think, calls that to attention a great deal. Those moments where the sporting spectacle and the creation of art slip back and forth to create something new. So I think here she's pointing out the melancholy of a basketball court when it isn't being used, the melancholy of a basketball court at night, the memory that exists in the surface, its capacity to be activated, as well as the simple beauty of those modernist marks that comprise the court itself. So I think it introduces a very different melancholic register to the exhibition that doesn't exist anywhere else. Most of these works, I think, interrogate the concept of sport and its various valences more directly, while Chanel, I think, is stepping back and being slightly more meditative in her reflection, not on the spectacle, but maybe on the deep meaning of sport and its relationship to growing up and community building. So for my final comment on an object, we're going to migrate out of Both Teams Played Hard and into another permanent collection gallery, and towards a painting by an artist that I'm particularly close to and I'm devoted to in all dimensions of her practice. And this is a work by Micheline Thomas, I'm sure familiar to many of you. Hyper characteristic of her painting, exists on an absolutely extraordinary scale. And I can say, standing next to the likeness that is this painting, and I will check the date for you. This was made in 2011 and is a recent addition to the collection. It has an extraordinary bracing force. So this institution, SFMOMA, went through a historically important deaccessioning, meaning the sale of a painting in 2019. And the painting that was sold was a work by Mark Rothko, which has some pretty extraordinary value on the secondary market. And the intent behind selling that painting was to radically diversify SFMOMA's collection. So there was an acknowledgement in that sale that museums, like every other cultural entity, are structured by bias, by racism, by discrimination by gender, discrimination by sexuality, that we're not exempt from culture's biases, rather we're reflective of them, and it's our obligation as a collecting institution, as an institution that makes exhibitions, to reckon with the bias of the past and do what we can in the present to look back over history, tell that history as it actually unfolded, so that the diversity of the story as it existed over time is represented on our walls, and make acquisitions that attest to a desire to represent and empower diverse communities within our institutions. And nobody does that with greater power than Micheline Thomas. This is a work that I take to be very summative of her interests. The work has amazing presence and scale. you feel as though you're very much in the thrall of her subject. You'll notice here that some of the defining marks on the surface are produced through rhinestones. She's like Mark, like Paul Pfeiffer, is forcing us to think about non-conventional art materials in the production of a classically artistic image. And I think that's extremely deliberate in that there's an interrogation of formal traditions of representation that have existed in art history for centuries, as well as a desire to open her own door, very much her own, make her marks in her own way, and produce new icons for the 20th into 21st century that sort of dance between a desire to claim space and power and representation through beautiful images with an acknowledgement of the history that led to that moment through the Renaissance and the production of icons that are centuries old, leading to the production of Michelin's icon, which I take to be one of the defining works in SFMOMA's collection. So a little disconnected from the exhibition focused on sports, but nonetheless extremely central to the mission of this museum, which has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion in all aspects of what we do. I think what is differentiating this museum as we enter a new chapter is a systemic embrace of that principle and an analysis of every decision we make through that lens. And I think as long as we continue to do that good work, and we make every decision from very small to large with the principles embedded in the surface of this painting in mind, we will be in great stead moving forward. So I think that concludes my monologue on these two extraordinary galleries. And I believe we have some time to field some questions from the audience. And I have a screen here. And I'm happy to read out questions that appear there. Okay, here we go. What was your path to becoming a museum director, and what do you love about it? I think my path to becoming a museum director was probably, honestly, my mother taking me to the National Gallery in London as a young man and having the experience of looking at works of French Impressionism and feeling that I was in the presence of something different and special that I wouldn't experience in any other aspect of culture. So I don't think I felt in any sense represented by those paintings, but I did feel welcome in that space. And that has a tremendous amount to do with the fact that the National Gallery in London is a collection held in public trust, and you can just wander in off the street and experience some of the great masterpieces of world history completely free of charge. And I love the idea of stewarding a museum that can do some of that work, and sort of the great promise that maybe one day a person walks in and is bitten by that bug, maybe by looking at this painting, and maybe that compels them to become an artist, an art historian, a curator, a conservator, a security officer at a museum like this one. So I think it's not only about opening the doors wide to the institution that appeals to me, it's opening minds once people have walked through the door in a way that would be impossible without the experience of being in a space like this one. Okay, here we go. You've made great efforts to connect with staff, board, and community members these first few months at SFMOMA. What's your future vision for SFMOMA? Wow, that's a very big question. So, my future vision for SFMOMA actually is relatively simply stated and has many, many layers of complexity within it. And I think I've intoned the same ideas throughout the course of this presentation. The idea I have in mind is that this colossus of an institution, I think, was constructed in order to tell a grand history. And we have a focus on 1900 to the present with a strength in the post-war period to the present. And we as a collective, meaning all of the curators, but everybody who works at this institution, is invested in the concept of a truth-based, equity-centered, research-driven art history that represents history as it actually unfolded and is made broadly accessible to the most diverse public imaginable. I'm really, really drawn to the complexity, cosmopolitanism, internationalism of San Francisco, its relationship to the Pacific Rim, the diversity of the Pacific Rim, and the ways in which we can work with art and artists, both from the past and the present, to register that extraordinary diversity and build an art history that's representative of, quite literally, the world. So that was my, that's my modest aspiration, is to be that institution. I think we're seeding the beginnings of that in many of these galleries. Both teams played hard, being a really good example of making complex ideas and some of the great artists in history differently accessible to a broad community. So that compels me greatly. Okay, we've heard that community engagement and access to art are important to you. Can you share any upcoming projects that tie into that priority? So what I'll say in response to that fabulous question is that almost everything we do is centered on audience growth, audience diversification, naturalizing the experience of this museum to everyone, and making it clear that it's for, about, and of the Bay Area and beyond. So a couple of things we're doing in service of that in the immediate future are, as I said, making the second floor of this institution entirely free, so 66,000 square feet of space in which you can experience Micheline Thomas, Mark Bradford, Mark Rothko, the Seeker exhibition, and countless other masterpieces absolutely free of charge, to say nothing of installations that are in our Roberts Family Gallery, in our Bota Atrium. So it's an abundance, and I take that to be enormously important. We also, as a consequence of the generosity of a number of Bay Area philanthropists, are, along with 21 other institutions across this city, free and open to the public absolutely completely in our entirety this coming weekend, December 3rd and 4th. So I believe that we've had something like 70,000 unique responses to that invitation, and I take that to be enormously encouraging when it comes to community appetite for the good work that we do here at SFMOMA and in the 20 other visual arts institutions that are participating in that endeavor. So those are just two very immediate examples, but it is our effort to keep going with that work in an effort to signal our availability to the community. We're also reopening our restaurant on 3rd Street, upcoming in the middle of December. We have an installation by the extraordinary artist Wu Sang that's being installed in our atrium. And we have an installation by local legend, local gem, Susan O'Malley, that will grace our Howard Street entrance. So there's a lot going on, and it all has to do with radical hospitality, flinging the doors open, making ourselves available, and presenting art that's both seductive and sophisticated in equal measure. Okay, on to the next question. What plans do you have to connect with the local artist community in the Bay Area? What Bay Area community orgs would you like SFMOMA to partner with? So there are many, and I think necessarily many and boundless. I think partnership is absolutely key to making sure that this city in its entirety rises, and that feels very pressing to me in the aftermath of the pandemic and some of the economic difficulties and other difficulties that we've suffered as a consequence of that very dark period from which we're emerging. But I think it's really, really important that we work together as a cultural community to make ourselves the heartbeat of this city in an effort to make the whole rise. So a number of great partners that I've encountered so far, I'll name just a couple. Minetta White, who is the still relatively newly minted director of MOAD, who is our near neighbor at SFMOMA. We're in the beginning stages of discussing what a great partnership would look like there, and that excites me massively. I think that there is a service we can perform for MOAD, and there's great enrichment that they can bring to our institution. I think together we'll be better. Another great passion of mine is Creative Growth, which is a progressive arts institution in the East Bay that has for decades championed the work of artists with disabilities, and hundreds and hundreds over the course of their storied lifespan as an institution. I take them to be the Museum of Modern Art in the world of artists with disabilities, and my experience there thus far has been, for me, transformative, in the partnership that I feel very strongly about. And I think we can use those mutual learnings to differentiate and enrich the core of this museum, its exhibition schedule, as well as its acquisition practices, in order to, again, change and diversify art history. So those are just two potential partnerships upcoming that I find uniquely compelling. Okay, here we go. Well, this person's being very nice. They say, welcome to SF. Did you hear of the Sergeant Johnson wood sculpture that's in the Western Edition? It's unmarked and laying in an open lot? My answer to that question, unfortunately, is no. so I think we probably need to move on to the next one. I will come back to that, however, do the necessary research, and maybe we can reach out to you. What is the most unexpected discovery about living in the Bay Area? I feel like I have an unexpected experience living in the Bay Area on a near daily basis. One of them is the experience of feeling like a tourist every time I look out the window. So I have the privilege of living on the 26th floor of an apartment building at the moment, alone with my beloved cat. And every morning I wake up, the sun rises, and I see the city, basked in this light. And, I see the movement of fog through the city, and I realize that it's one of those few magical places left. And I think I am surprised by the sensation of feeling so fortunate to live in a place of such phenomenal natural and cultural beauty. And so it feels like a great privilege to me to be here doing this work at SFMOMA. So I'm looking at the time, and I realize that we might be out of time. But I'm going to take just a couple more questions since we started slightly late. And for any of you sticking around, I'll blather on for a little bit longer. So it says, how do you plan to diversify SFMOMA staff? So I would say that the answer to that question is it takes a tremendous amount of work, but it's incredibly easy. It simply means that you make a decision to enrich the culture of your institution through an emphasis on diversity with every single hire that you make. I'm a very deep believer in the fact that the more heterogeneous a community is, the more effective we are together. That's the conviction around the diversification of the canon. It's not simply a moral conviction, although it is that, and it's not simply exercising a series of ethics in the way that I and others act in the workplace. It's out of a really deep feeling that excellence and equity are the same thing. And in the context of building a community or building an art history, the more various it is, the better it is, the more people have access, the more complicated our stories are, and the more truthful they are in relationship to history. So my approach to diversity is ruthless on one hand, is that we make every decision with that in mind. And systemic too. So it's not just an exhibition and an acquisition. It's exhibitions, it's acquisitions, it's board, it's staff, it's vendor decisions, it's investment decisions, it's the totality of this museum. And my feeling is, if we can model the world through the way that we operate, people will absorb that modeling when they come through our doors and maybe take some of that spirit with them when they leave, and they can become the agents of change that maybe we imagine, they imagine in the broader world. Very funny. What do you get from Steps Coffee Cafe 5 at SFMOMA? So it's a culinary question. So from the Steps Cafe, they have one absolutely extraordinary turkey sandwich that I love and have periodically. They also have really, really wonderful coffee. Latte is my preference. And then in Cafe 5, I think Cafe 5 is one of the most architecturally successful restaurants I've ever been in the museum. The relationship between indoor and outdoor, the experience of sky and skyscrapers and art and cuisine all in one seamless place makes me feel very fortunate to work at SFMOMA. So when I go there, there is a salad, I believe it's a corn salad, and I laden it with protein, and it's very, very enjoyable, and I highly recommend it. What are you looking forward to in 2023? And this is my last question. In 2023, I'm looking forward to a variety of things at the institution. One thing I'll say personally is I'm looking forward to the arrival of my family in San Francisco. So I have a wife and two daughters, a son. My son's at college. I have two daughters starting school here, and a wife in a supportive but reluctant fashion migrating from Baltimore to the Bay Area. And so I'm extremely, extremely excited about that because I think it will make me even more effective and enthusiastic at work as we really dig in together to meet our mission, which is very simply stated again. Our effort is to radically diversify the people that we reach, radically grow our audience, engage in acts of radical hospitality that make this museum irresistible to the public. And I think if we pursue those goals with every decision, we will be able to meet our goal of becoming a community-centered museum inside and out. So I've talked a great deal. I want to thank you all for listening. It's been a great pleasure. I urge you all to come to SFMOMA. If you feel like buying a ticket to the Diego Rivera exhibition, there is still time to have that amazing experience. If you want to experience our permanent collection, you can do so for free, beginning with the Seeker exhibition, spanning the entirety of our second floor. And as I mentioned, we're reopening our restaurant on 3rd Street, and that should be a big community hit and bonanza upcoming, and something I'm very excited for. So there's an abundance here. I enjoy it every day, and I think you will too. So thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you all again soon.